just to review, yesterday we had a fantastic machlokes, and that concerned itself with you put a schach on top of a portico, okay, extending from a group of homes, right? There was a portico, like a roof, and you put schach over here. So if you have like posts over here, everybody agrees, according to the way we're learning now, it's kosher. I mean, because you have three walls, you can make a sukkah in the middle over here. But what happens if it does not have any posts going all the way around? And the roof from the wall of the house to the start of the schach is more than 4 amas. So you don't say dov and akuma. So Rava says it's a pasul sukkah. Why? You don't have walls. Comes along Abaya, and he says that no, you do have walls. Why? Because pi tikra yored v'saisim, the edge of the top of the roof goes down and closes off, makes an enclosure over here. To make you a sukkah over here. And that was where we ended off yesterday, machlokes. So now the Mishnah we're going to ask on one of them. Abaya says you have a sukkah. Rava says you don't have a sukkah. So now if you go back to our Mishnah, which is on Daf Yud Zayin, I believe. Where's this Mishnah? The Mishnah says a chotzir, which is what we we're just talking about, shu mukafes aksadra, which has a portico all around it. And if it has more than yesh tachtav arba amas, if there's more than 4 amas from that roof to the schach pesula, it's pasul. If it's less, then it's kosher. So this Mishnah is the same case, and yet the Mishnah says it's pasul. You don't say pi tikra yored v'saisim. So it's a very open question from our Mishnah against Abaya. Tanan. Okay, here we're beginning Daf Yutesam and Aleph, 4 lines from the top. Daf Yutesam and Aleph, 4 lines from the top. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah. You have a courtyard that's surrounded by a portico, okay, a roof. And the Mishnah says, if the roof is more than 4 amas till the beginning of the schach, it's pasul. Va'amai, according to you, Abaya, why does the Mishnah say it's pasul? Let us say pitikra, the edge of the roof, yored v'saisem, goes down and closes off the area to make a valid sukkah. So the answer is Tirgama Rava Aliba Abaya. Rava, who disagrees with Abaya, will say he comes to the defense of Abaya, intellectual honesty, and he says that even according to Abaya, our Mishnah is not difficult. Why? Because our Mishnah is talking about a case when you made the schach flush with the roof. Let's take a look at the picture. The picture would be this picture. Here, this is what our Mishnah is talking about. Where flush with the portico, you have the schach. Now, when do you say pi tikra yored v'soisem? Is when I can see visually schach on top of the portico. So I can see a thickness of a schach, and therefore I can say that thickness of the schach is the start of the wall. Like over here in this case, even though they didn't make it too thick in this picture, but the thickness of the ledge of the schach become the start of a wall that goes down and closes off the area. But here, when it's flush, you can't tell what is the schach and what is the ksadra, what is the portico. And since it's flush, then nobody, even the Mishnah, therefore the Mishnah says you don't say pi tikra yored v'soisem. That's what they mean. Okay, now Besura Masin Lahosh Maitza B'Hailishna. In Surah, they had the machlokes between Abaya and Rava regarding, like we discussed, do you say pi tikra yored v'saisim? Do you say the ledge closes off the area? The Pumpadisa Masni. In Pumpadisa, they had a different version of the machlokes between Abaya and Rava. Sikach al gabi aksadra she'ein lo pesula patzimim divrihakol psula. In the case where you make the schach on top of a portico that does not have posts, everybody agrees it's psula. In other words, in this case, you never say pi tikra yared v'soisim. Even Abaya doesn't say pi tikra yared v'soisim. There's no such a thing in this case. But when you say yesh lo pitzimim, but if it does have posts, then Abaya says kashera, it's kosher. Rava alma pesula, Rava will say it's pesula. Abaya alma kashera amrina lavud. You say you close off the posts, even though there's a space, a gap between the posts, you consider them closed. Rava alma pesula lo yamrina lavud. Rava says psula because you do not say we close off the post. What is the machlokes? In this case, is the machlokes between Abaye and Rava. Notice you have space in between the posts. So Abaye holds simple. This is kosher walls because you say lavud. You close off the space of the wall, and therefore it's a good functioning wall for a sukkah, for schach on top. Rava, the way this version learns the machlokes, holds that what? You don't say lavud. Why? Obviously, it's a halacha l'Moshe Messina that you close gaps, but the reason is because where is the post made for? The post made to wall in from the door of the home to the post. In other words, supposed to wall in the area underneath the portico. So therefore, actually, these posts were made for the inner, underneath the inner part, not for the outer part. And therefore, Rava says this concept of lavud would only work if the wall was built for the intention of the inside, but since of the inside of the sukkah. But since these posts were built for the intention of the people walking right out of the home underneath the portico, you would not say lavud to make it a kosher sukkah. That's a fascinating thing. That was the opinion of that was the version of Pumpadisa, how they learned. Says the Gemara, the Hilkasa Kilishona Kama, the halacha is like the first lashon, that you do say lavud in the case where there's posts, but you will paskin like Rava, that you would not say, when there is no post, you would not say pitikra yored v'soisim. You don't do that. So that's ends the Gemara. The Gemara just brings a story. Rav Ashi ashkache l'Rav Kahana de komisachech al gabe aksadra. Rav Ashi found Rav Kahana and he made a sukkah like this, the same sukkah without petzimin, without posts, and this was his chach. So he asks Rav Kahana, Amalei. So Rav Ashi asked Rav Kahana, how could you make a sukkah like that? Like do you not hold Rava yesh lo petzimin kashera? Do you not hold that if there is petzimin posts, there's kosher? Ein lo petzimin pesula. If there is no petzimin, it's puzzle. So Rava would hold that this is not a kosher sukkah. So how did you make this sukkah in such a manner? So there's no walls in your sukkah. So achve nira achvele. So Rav Kahana showed Rav Ashi that it is a kosher sukkah. Nira bebifnim b'shava b'chutz. Inami nira b'chutz b'shava bebifnim. You have to see the picture. The picture is that actually when Rav Ashi walked into Rav Kahana's place where he was making a sukkah, he looked at the place. He sees two walls. Okay, there are two walls over here. Where's the third wall? You're going to say pi tikra yerd v'soisim. This pi tikra, the lip of this portico is considered your beginning of your third wall. Rav Ashi asked to Rav Kahana, we don't paskin that way. We don't say pi tikra yerd v'soisim. So where's your third wall? So he showed him that you were walking in from the wrong direction, because when you're within the sukkah, you could actually see the three walls. If you're walking from behind the sukkah, you think there are only two walls. So there's like an optical illusion over here. And that's why Rav Ashi did not see the beginning of the third wall, because it was a minor wall. It was two normal walls. And then there's this minor wall, like a tefach, which is kosher. Or nira mi b'chutz. If you sometimes you can have a wall that if you're in the sukkah, you can't see the wall, which begins on the outer portion of the sukkah, like in this case, like in this picture over here, where actually, if Rav Ashi was, they have the guy standing on the wrong direction. But if the Rav Ashi was standing over here, he would be able to see only two walls. But if Rav Kahana took him behind and he says, hey, we have a third wall over here. It's not in the sukkah, but it begins behind the sukkah. That could be that could be considered the third wall. Where do you have this concept that if you don't see it, it could still be considered a wall? We had this once before in Hilchas Erevin. You have to put a lechi in a courtyard in order to carry, in an alleyway, in order to carry in the alleyway, right? You have to put a post. So normally you put the post right on the side wall over here. But if it's a post, a reminder post, a lechi, that you could only see if you're walking on the street, but if you're in the alleyway, you don't see it, it's still considered a kosher lechi. And that's the proof that you don't have to see the wall in the sukkah. If it can be seen from the outside of the sukkah, it's still a kosher wall. The itma we learned in Hilchas Erevin, nira mebechutz, if you have a lechi that you could see on the outside of the wall, v'shava bebifnim, but it looks flush on the inside. On the inside of the alleyway, you can't see a lechi. Only on the outside, nida mishil lechi, it's counted as a lechi, and v'lechi hainu patzimin, and lechi is the same thing as the wall of the sukkah, that sometimes there are walls of a sukkah that if you're in the sukkah, you don't really see the wall, but if you're standing behind the sukkah, you can see that there is a wall, and that's still kosher enough for a wall, for the third wall. Next, new Gemara. Tana, we learned in a brisa, pesel. Pesel is another name for kosher schach. It comes from the word pesoilus, the waste products of your vineyard and of your threshing of the wheat. That's like wood. You could allow to use that as schach. So the pesel, you have kosher schach, hayotzi min sukkah, that extends from a sukkah. Nidan kasukah, that's considered part of the sukkah. Now, what does that mean? Ma pesel hayotzi min sukkah. What's the case of kosher schach that extends from a regular sukkah? So you got to see the picture. There's going to be a number of explanations. This is a kosher schach. You actually enter from the other side, but in the back they extended the schach. And then you have like another, in the back of it, you have another sukkah over here. So this is an extension of the inner sukkah. This is what called pesel hayotzim in a sukkah, schach that extends from a kosher sukkah. This will be also considered a kosher sukkah. That's what the Gemara says. That's the first teretz. Amma Ula, Ula explains this brisa to mean konam hayotzim lachoyrei sukkah, beams that come from behind the sukkah, and therefore that extension becomes a sukkah. So the Gemara asks, didn't know, I showed you the picture, but I showed you the end result. But the Gemara just thought that there's just schach coming out. But don't you need three walls? You made the walls, you extended the sukkah to make three walls. But doesn't have to be as the size of a kosher sukkah, which is 7 tfachim. We're talking about a case where there is. So, if this is the case, remember, what is the chiddush? In other words, look at this picture. What could be wrong with this sukkah? Why would I think that this is a apostle of sukkah? Answers the Gemara, Mao the same. I would have thought, Hoyel ul gavai avidi, v'livroi loy avidi, eimalo kamash malan. I would have thought that since the walls, especially the back wall of the sukkah, was made for the inside sukkah, not the back sukkah. So it's made for the gavai, the inside, it's made for, uvelavroi, for the outside, loyavidi. Emaloi, I would think this would not be a kosher sukkah. Kamash malam, the Brisa teaches you that it is a kosher sukkah. Despite the fact that when you built the sukkah, this particular wall over here was meant for the inside, not for the outside. Nevertheless, and I think this wall also was meant for the inside sukkah, not for the outside. I would think that this part is not kosher. Kamash malam, if it forms a sukkah, it is kosher. That's called konim hayotzim in a sukkah. That's one way to explain the brisa. Case number 2 to explain the brisa. Rabbi Yosef Amri Tavaya Haka. Here we're talking about the konim hayotzim lefnim in a sukkah. That means this picture over here. You have a schach that extends further in the sukkah, but the wall doesn't extend. In other words, the wall just stops over here, and you basically have one wall over here. Is this part considered a kosher sukkah right underneath here? The Mishnah tells you it is kosher. So the Gemara says, Mahu desema, I would have thought that this case, one wall you're extending to match up. One wall extended it. Mahu desema holes be hechshasukkah. there is no kosher sukkah over here. Kamash malan that you do say it's kosher, because at the end of the day, the inner part of it is kosher. I mean, there are 3 walls in the back of this sukkah. So, and these are kosher walls, right? So since this part is still underneath the schach, and you have basically a 1 wall over here, we consider this as if this part is part of this one whole sukkah, even though there's no wall over here, and it's a kosher sukkah. This has to be extending, let's say, at least 7 tefachim. It's not small. So you have 3 walls, but the 1 wall didn't extend all the way. This part is still kosher as the sukkah. That's another way to explain what kanem hayotzim in a sukkah. Rabba v'Rabbi Yochanan Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he said, the Bryce is talking about something else. Most of the sukkah, we're talking about there's enough shade more than the sunshine. And a little part of the sukkah, you have more sun than shade. Now, this is the picture. The picture is like this. You have a nice sukkah over here. And then when you get to the front of the sukkah, there's very little schach, right? So this could be an extension of the sukkah. The Mishnah sees that this is part of a kosher sukkah. And of course, we could look at this as a whole entity. And since most of the sukkah has shade more than sun, this part will still be part of a kosher sukkah. That's what he says. And a little part of the sukkah, you have very little schach. The sun more than shade. Mahu the same, I would have thought, tipaso bahach purta. That's possible in that little area where there's very little schach. Kamash malam, that we say that it's kosher. Umay yoitze. What does it mean, yoitze? What is that called, yoitze? Yoitze mehechsher sukkah. It leaves. Yoitze means it leaves from being a kosher sukkah. Because the Gemara, the language that the Brisa use is pesel hayoitze min sukkah. Schach that leave a sukkah. What does that mean? Schach that leave a sukkah. Schach that are no more part of a kosher sukkah. That's what it is. Schach that are no more part of a kosher sukkah. So then it's still considered kosher since it's all an extension of this normal sukkah. So even though this doesn't have enough schach, this part will still be kosher. That's another way to explain the Brisa. And Rabbi Aishia explains the Brisa like this. You have schach posel that's less than 3 in a small sukkah. Let's see what a small sukkah look like. Imagine this is a small sukkah. You have 4.2 of kosher schach. Now, if there's ear space over here, you would close it off. Imagine there was no schach over here, nothing, just blank ear. Then you know the din of loved. You imagine that it's closed off over here, fine. But the Brisa teaches you that if you have posel schach, these are non-kosher metal studs. They also would make this tiny sukkah kosher because most of the sukkah is covered with schach, more than 4 tefachim, and the posel schach is less than 3 tefachim. So it's kosher schach. So the Gemara is going to ask a question on that. Rabbi Shia nitzchal schach posel, pachos mishloisha, that's less than 3 tefachim, besukkah katan, in a small sukkah. Uma yoitze. What is this word yoitze? These are posel schach yoitze mitayr sukkah. That is not accordance to the halachos of a sukkah because you can't make schach out of metal studs. Maskiv lo Rav Shaya said, what is the chiddush? What is the novelty of that statement? Of course, it's a kosher sukkah. Maskiv lo Rav Shaya lo yeh el aver. Even if it was just plain air, no schach posel in that location. V'avir pachos mishloish tefachim b'sukkah tana mi posel. If you just had air space, less than 3 tefachim in a small sukkah, would it be a posel sukkah? I mean, imagine there was no schach over here. Certainly it would be a kosher sukkah because you say loved. So just because you put posel schach, why should it make it anything worse? And if anything, posel schach is less strict than ear space. Remember that. Posel schach, to posel a sukkah, you need 4 tefachim if it's the middle of a sukkah. And ear space, no schach, posels a sukkah with 3 tefachim. So what is the chiddush of this novel idea? So the Gemara is going to say a special chiddush. you could sleep and eat under the pasal schach. The pasal schach become kosher. That's what it says. Fascinating. Amalei abrababa zeh mitzdaraf v'shenim tachtev. Pasal schach, you could actually become part of the kosher schach, and you could sleep under it. Sleeping is a euphemism for eating and doing whatever, and living in the sukkah there, make a bracha there. But if there was just an airspace over there, mitzdaref, it would make it a kosher sukkah. The ain yishenim tachta, but you can't sleep under there. So it's a fascinating thing what the Gemara just said. The Gemara just said that you could actually sleep under this pasal schach, because the pasal schach combines with the kosher schach, and this becomes a kosher sukkah. Now, you can't make a whole sukkah out of pasal schach, but it could combine with a kosher schach to become a kosher sukkah. So the Gemara asked, where do you find that concept? Mi ika midi. Wherever else in halacha would you find the itzterufim itzdaref? You could combine it to make it a kosher something. But it itself alone, it cannot be rendered kosher. So why, if something itself is not kosher, how could it combine with something to become kosher? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elyashiv. Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elyashiv said, you find that concept. As we go to Yotes Amud Sheni, tit hanoroik. You have tit, let's say mud, that's a mortar. Yachiach, that will prove. That means, you have to make a mikvah, it has to have 40 saw of rainwater. But let's say you have this mortar type of muddy liquid that you only have, let's say, 38 saw of water, and you have this tit hanoroik, you could add it, shemitzdaref labarim saw. You can make that combine with the water to become 40 saw and make a kosher mikvah. But if you toivel in it, if you have a 40 saw full of tit hanoroik, then also like tefillah, it wouldn't work as a tefillah. So it itself, tit hanoroik in hilchas mikvahs, is like pasal schach. You can't make a mikvah out of tit hanoroik, but it can combine with the under shear of, let's say, 38 saw of water with tit hanoroik could make a kosher sukkah. So you're seeing that same idea of that as well. Okay. The Mishnah in Mikvah talks about, let's say, snow. Snow is also something like that could help make a sukkah, make a mikvah, but it itself, you can't be toivel in snow. So this is one of the things that are listed in that Mishnah, like a sheleg, barad, and ice, that you can't make a mikvah because it's solid. But if you have 38 saw of water, you can combine the snow and it could become a valid mikvah. Next Mishnah. We're going to do this Mishnah to this Mishnah, and then we'll be finished. We saw this before. Somebody makes a sukkah like a teepee. Now, I'm sure that I don't see it in this picture. That's why this picture is not so good. There must have to be a third wall over here, because if you don't have 3 walls, of course, it's not a kosher sukkah. But imagine a guy put a third wall, but made the roof to come to a point. So you can't really tell what's a wall, what's a roof. So the Mishnah says, you make your sukkah like a teepee, or you put it up against the wall like the other picture. Again, you made 3 walls over here. So the Mishnah says, Rabbi Lezer paisel. Rabbi Lezer says it's paisel ain't lo gag, because there is no roof. To be called a sukkah, you have to be able to tell what's called your roof and what's called your wall. And this is a roof wall because it's leaning, it's a roof and a wall at the same time. Chacham say that this sukkah would be kosher. Tana, we learned in the Brisa. Moide Rabbi Lezer would agree, if you raised the sukkah, this teepee sukkah, off the ground, the tefach, that is kosher. Let's take a look at the picture. If you lifted it off the ground, like you're doing over here, you put a brick underneath, so then even Rabbi Lezer would agree it's kosher. Why? Because you could actually define, not necessarily it's kosher, but you could define that this will be like the wall and this will be the roof. So therefore, that Rabbi Lezer would, since you could look at it and define what's a wall, what's a roof, it would be a kosher sukkah. I would want to point out to you that although this rises 10 tefachim, more than 10 tefachim in the air, there must be a width of 10 tefach or 7 tefachim over here. Because if there's no width of 7 tefachim, obviously it's not a kosher sukkah. Sukkah has to have walls high 10 and a width throughout of 7 tvachim. But even so, Rabbi Lezer would require to put a brick underneath. So a tefach of a brick would make sure that people from the outside can view a wall and a roof, and you can define it in such a way, and therefore it would be kosher. Because my time I the Rabbanan, but why do Rabbanan say that you don't need a brick? Why do they say that it could be on the ground, it's slanted? Because shipuri oilim ka'olim don. Just because a tent is slanted is considered an oil, and therefore you don't need to raise it off the ground. The Chachamim say it's kosher no matter what. Abaya, it depends. Basically, the Machlekes says, how do you define the word sukkah? The word sukkah means roof, but a roof is only a roof if you have a wall. So you have to have definitive outline of a wall and a roof. And that's why Reb Lezer says it's possible unless you can define it. But Rabbi Chachamim say, no, Shepiwa Oilim, even a slanty tent is still called a tent. Abaya Ashkache le Rav Yosef the Kognei Beksilas Chasanim Besukkah. Rav Aya found Rav Yosef. He was sleeping in a sukkah like he's supposed to, but he was sleeping in a bed that had a teepee under it, like a teepee that covered the whole bed. Now Rav Yosef felt that because a teepee is not considered a tent, it's discounted. And it's not a hefsek, it's not an interruption between him and the sukkah, because anything that comes on a slant is not called an oil. So he's not sleeping in an oil, so he's actually sleeping in the sukkah, even though you have this cover over him that forms a teepee. So he must hold like Reb Lezer, that a slanted tent is not called a tent. Amalei, so Abaye said to him, come on, to Reb Lezer, you're holding like Reb Lezer that a slanted tent is not called a tent. You must be pasking like Rabbi Lezer in the Mishnah. Shavat ke Rabbanim v'avet ke Rabbi Lezer. You leave the Rabbanim and do like Rabbi Lezer. According to Rabbanim, you're not allowed to sleeping this kilas chasanim in this slanted roof bed, because that roof bed, the slanted teepee bed, is an interruption between you sleeping on the bed and the sukkah on top of you. And you say you could do it. You must be paskening like Rabbi Eliezer. Amalei. So he said, the truth is I'm pasking like the Chachamim. Brisa Ipchatani. I have a brisa that says the opposite version of who said what. There's a brisa that says Rabbi Lezer machshe. Rabbi Lezer says it's kosher. The Chachamim paisel. Chachamim will pasel. Chachamim say a slanted tent is not called a tent. So therefore, I went like this version of the Chachamim that say it's pasel, and therefore it's not an interruption between me and the sukkah on top. So the Gemara says you have two versions of who said what. In this version, you say the Chachamim say paislim, but our Mishnah's version, you have the Chachamim say kosher. So the Gemara asks, Shavkis masnisin ba'avdid kebraisa. You left our Mishnah and you paskin like the brisa. Our Mishnah seems to be more authentic than a brisa. Amalei, so Rav Yosef explained to Abaya, masnisin yichidahi. Our Mishnah version of who said what was just one opinion. It was a yachid. The Tanya we learned in a Mishnah. The Tanya we learned in a brisa. A person makes a sukkah like a teepee or puts it up against a wall. Here, Rab Nosson Omer, Rab Nosson says, Rab Lezer paisel b'nei shein lagad. Rab Nosson was the one that said, Rab Lezer said pasel because it doesn't have a roof, and the Chachamim say machshir. And this is the version of our Mishnah. But who's explaining who said what? Rab Nosson heard that this is the machlokes. Rab Lezer says pasel, Chachamim say kosher. But the brisa actually reverses the opinions. That Rab Lezer was the one that said kosher, and Chachamim say pasel. If the Chachamim say pasel, that means anything that's flush on the ground comes to a point at the top, and you can't tell what's a wall and what's a roof, is not called an oil. Therefore, Rav Yosef slept in this type of bed in the sukkah, even though it blocked his vision of the schach, because it's not considered a interruption. Sleeping on it's still considered as if he's sleeping in the sukkah, because that teepee is not considered a block between him and the sukkah on top. And therefore, Rabbi Yosef slept in the Gilas Chasanim because he paskined like the Chachamim that a shipui oil is not called an oil. Okay, so we will stop over here on Yutes Omud Sheni. by this Mishnah because it's a whole long another sugya coming up.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Okay.
Good enough.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
A gute Nacht, Baruch.